Broadcasting live from the J.P. Morgan Chase & Company headquarters in New York, New York. It's Radio Free Starajavoy. Folks, we have a great one for you tonight. If you remember way back in the halcyon days of 2015, there was a film called The Big Short. That flick sought to explain the 2008 housing crisis and its attendant recession. We're trying to do something similar, to explain the coming crisis and some of its factors. However, while The Big Short was made 7 years after the crisis, we're making this episode 7 months, 7 weeks, even 7 days perhaps before our crisis. So there may be some technical inaccuracies. I'm not Steve Carell. I'm Bang Bang Duck.
Hi, I'm not Brad Pitt or Aelita.
I am not Ryan Gosling. I'm Gilded Cataphract.
Our action-packed show for you tonight is going to include we're going to cover about 6 different things. First, we're going to talk about the declining rate of profit, which is the mechanism that's causing all these crises, and the mechanism that's ultimately going to unwork capitalism's ability to maintain itself. Then we're going to talk about how that applies to the real world in a section we like to call secular stagnation. This is the tendency since the neoliberal period for economies to kind of stop growing. Then we're going to talk about the 2008 crisis, the response to that crisis, and some of the implications of that response. Then we're going to move to what's developing just today and yesterday, which is a crisis of demand. Finally, we're going to discuss some of the major bubbles in the economy that are going to pop over the next coming year or possibly months. And finally, we're going to talk about some ways that you can keep yourself, your loved ones, and your folks safe through the rough times. Let's start off with the declining rate of profit. Anyone who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, inevitably, costs in the production of things will rise, which inevitably starts eating into the amount of money you can use to make off it. Let's look at entertainment, which is often cited as the recession-proof industry. Movies and games will just always grow every year. However, we started to see a point where the amount of money being sunk into them is growing exponentially, but the amount of extra profit they're getting is still very linear. Jurassic Park had a budget of $50 million. Jurassic World has a budget that's nearly an order of magnitude greater, but the amount of money it made is only I'd say twice or thrice as much.
Now, the reason this happens is because of something called the rising organic composition of capital. What that means is that the ratio of machines to labor in a developing industry, the ratio of machines, there's more machines, less labor. And the trick is that all value has to come from labor. And this is because in capitalism, unlike some economists would have you believe, you can't actually produce any new value from just trading things around. It has to actually come from somewhere. And there's 2 main sources. You can go to something that's already sort of commonly owned and make it private property. It's called enclosure, and it used to be the principal way of, as I understand it, used to be one of the most widespread ways of creating new value. Just going into someone's farmland or house or village and saying, you belong to me now, and this is mine. And this was very prominent up until about 200 years ago, when capitalism entered an era of exploitation. In this system, essentially workers are left with only the ability to produce for a wage. And this wage is always lower than the amount they can produce.
In essence, it's important to remember the fundamental observation made all the way back with Adam Smith that effectively, as he's quoted in The Wealth of Nations, the real price of everything, what everything really costs the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What everything is really worth to a man who has acquired it and who wants to dispose of it or exchange it for something else is the toil and trouble which he can save himself and which he can impose upon other people. Effectively, the growth in wage labor is that process of imposing toil onto other people. And so, as capital expands during the era of exploitation, you have people who were once petty proprietors who, say, had an artisanal workshop where they produced goods that they sold on the market, would now start to acquire more and more hirelings who would engage in the process of production, paying them a wage and then keeping the surplus.
Um, Now, when you introduce a machine into that, you can actually it affects a multiplicative effect. Give me a second. All right, sorry about that. Once you add a machine into that relationship, it exerts a multiplicative effect on the amount of production uh, you can do. However, these machines have to be purchased at a price, and they run down over time. So in effect, you can think of those machines as giving little slivers of themselves into that production. This way, we maintain an equality in the value of the machine as it's purchased versus the value of the machine that's depreciated over time. Uh, this means that as you increase the amount you can produce in industrial capitalism, one of the things you're increasing the amount of is the amount of machines. This is called automation in sort of bourgeois economics. And they understand that it has issues regarding like job losses, but they don't understand why it's truly a problem for the economy as a whole. Uh, so this automation results in kind of an ironic issue where you have the ability to produce more and more, but with that ability, you lose the society doesn't actually get to enjoy the riches of that improved production.
In effect, those machines are just past labor that has been saved up in this process, dead labor, so to speak. And more, as you accumulate more of it, more of the total product created by living labor today has to go towards paying for the dead labor. Marx likened this process to an almost vampiric blood sucking that is, of course, goes towards the people who own capital, who are the primary benefactors of this relationship. But it must be emphasized that even they are not fully in control of this process. This is how he described it in the manifesto as like a spell the sorcerer has created that he has lost control of. The value of objects in the market, the accumulation of capital, the need to continue to generate profits has a logic of its own that is outside the control of any businessman or even national governments at this point.
Yeah, like to go back to the Jurassic Park example, the dead labor would come in the form of all those computers that you have to buy in order to produce all the your favorite CGI monsters to chase the hero of the week.
Um, anyway, so this becomes a problem because it means that the ability of these industries to generate profit and thus the ability of these industries to attract new investment declines over time. Uh, since the 19 since the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, there's been something called that a lot of mainstream economists have called secular stagnation. Basically, in the industrialized core of the capitalist world, the first world, you could say, there's been a decline in growth. There's been a lack of dynamism and a lack of movement. Part of this is because this has been exported into the third world, especially since the 1990s, and I think more and more since China joined the World Trade Organization. But the fundamental problem continues to affect people in the first world today. This all came to a head in 2008 when the consumption that had sort of driven the American economy up until then, founded primarily upon like the promise of home ownership and the promise of a sort of independence through action in the capitalist system, sort of came apart because the underlying economy could no longer sustain people continuing to purchase houses, could no longer sustain people continuing to purchase commodities at the rates that uh, they had been assumed to be able to maintain. Since 2008 was in a fairly limited section of the economy, and it took place. Can someone jump in and help me who maybe knows a little more about this? But as I understand it, in 2008, uh, the 2008 crisis took place primarily in the United States, and similar crises happened across the Eurozone and in parts of Asia that were reflective of the same trend in industry, but not directly related to the popping off of the American bubble.
All right, Millions.
Yeah, I was gonna say like an interesting thing about like how home ownership sustained that for like so long, the like leading into the crisis was that you had these like neat little like four-walled units like replicated with that like the bourgeois nuclear family form uh that one like effectively tied like laborers more to the production process in their jobs and like anchored their sort of like interest in that with a so like a debt that fed directly into the interest of the national economy. Plus, like within these like units too, like for like the thinking of means of subsistence being sold back to people in commodity form, you've got these just like neatly organized like pockets for commodity consumption in a sustainably like a sustainable model for social reproduction at that period. Um, as far as the other crises go as well, like on a global scale, I think a lot of that how they kind of kicked off are like related, but also in different areas. Probably has to do with like post Bretton Woods, like changing of like currency in like the U.S. dollar being delinked from this like gold standard in its commodity form into this more like debt based currency throughout the world and like extensions through the IMF, World Bank that effectively turn like US debt into a global reserve currency.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it sort of means that, and I hate to say it, the gold bugs, you might have remember these creatures flittering around the internet after 2001, who proposed that all of the ills in feature that, excuse me, all of the ills that were facing American society were fundamentally caused by the delinking of US currency from the gold standard. They are mistaking effect for cause in this case, though. The delinking of the US currency, in fact, global currencies from gold standards, came because the it had previous it imposed a barrier to the circulation of capital that needed to be overcome. That the tying of money to a specific commodity had effectively forced certain national economies into dependence on the price of gold. The availability of gold affected exchange rates. All right, Millions, what do you have to say?
Yeah, and like I think that's the interesting thing part too, because it's like we can't like look at money today in like a commodity form, and also like the whole like issue with the gold thing and like those gold bugs like you were mentioning like is really funny because like I think you still like see people like that like pushing like or these are the same sort of people that freak out about looking at the US debt and everything and kind of like don't see how like turning like our national debt into this global reserve currency is like a far more sustainable measure for like capitalism on a global scale.
Well, it is until it isn't. Sorry.
No, I mean it's a more volatile like period for like value measurements in accumulation. But at the time, like the growth it was having, it became like more sustainable than for like more sustainable to like the level of growth that was being pushed for rather than like relying on these sort of like metal sort of like backing.
And the US dollar being the global reserve currency means that effectively US dollars are good everywhere in the world. And has huge implications both for American manufacturers as well as American financiers.
And to relate that to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as well too, there's a thing that like counteracts that like falling rate of profit. Like in order to do that, like one way of countering that is being able to like raise like the total like the mass of the total social capital uh, inversely to uh, the like proportion in which like the profit rate is declining. So like these finance and debt mechanisms and like more fictitious forms of capital kind of like rise to be able to accommodate that at the rate.
You mean they sort of off the debt allows the government to offset its lowered profitability, the lower profitability of industry.
Yeah, yeah, by using these sort of like fictitious forms of capital to like rise like the mass of the total social capital.
And that's sort of how they've been dealing with crises since 2008. The idea is you reduce interest rates on loans. Essentially, it's a complicated but irrelevant. Through a complicated but irrelevant process, you increase the access to capital for firms. And so the idea is basically based on this Keynesian idea that like ghost dogs run the market, that like it's all about animal spirits and uh, stuff like that.
I think,
Where oh, go ahead.
yeah, a pertinent point that needs to be missed in the transition towards uh, res, monetarist, monetarist measures against crisis came after a very long period of financialization of capital. Everyone sort of understands intuitively that there's this innate tension between capital and labor. The amount of money that workers are demanding from their employers directly affects the profitability of the company. So on a micro scale, it is very important for employers to control those costs in order to maintain competitiveness in the market. But on the macro scale, all of those workers are also their primary consumers. In aggregate, if you lower the amount of money available to wage workers, you also lower demand. The way out of this problem to avoid giving more power to labor and thereby increasing labor's ability to challenge capital, the accumulation turned more towards loaning money back to consumers through financial instruments. And this took a wide variety of forms, both in terms of uh, loaning towards producers as well as home ownership through uh, government backed and guaranteed mortgages, credit cards, auto loans. A wide variety of financial instruments were being used to effectively loan this surplus value back to consumers to sustain demand.
And this is a potent way to paper over the problems of crises, because it does let you have more products being purchased. It does let you have more economic activity take place, and especially when you're lending to companies on a very large scale, it lets those companies uh, continue to operate through periods of uh, or downturns of economic activity when perhaps they aren't making very much money. And so, since in 2008 they decided, uh, well, I think MDL has something to say, but we're gonna get back to 2008 in a second. Okay, cut that out. So, in 2008, after 2008, the policy was to create a bunch of cheap money, give all that cheap money to businesses in an attempt to spur economic demand. And so what we saw actually happen was a whole bunch of bubbles started developing. We'll go into what these are later, but essentially the what happened in 2008 that was very different from, I think, previous crashes like the dot-com bubble was that the rate of profit was very, very low. This is because of the rising organic composition of capital, and all of this money had to be reinvested in tools and what we call fixed capital, what mainstream economists call capital, in dead labor. This resulted in a large amount of economic activity, but it also meant that the governments had to continue to apply these monetarist implements, had to continue to increase and expand the access to cheap money. And we see this in the US Fed, where they continue to lower interest rates even in the quote unquote boom time. Traditional economic logic would say you want to throttle back, you want to raise rates during the boom. But what's actually been happening since 2008 is there was no real rebound in the economy. There was no real rebound of profitable business and dynamic, self-sufficient business taking place. Instead, I would say the vast majority of large economic activity since 2008 has been of the form of governments effectively subsidizing unprofitable businesses through spurring, through lowering of rates, through adding more capital to the market. And all they can do, it's like they're running on a treadmill, because the more of these companies are unprofitable, and the more unprofitable they are, the worse the economy looks. So you have to continue applying more and more cheap credit. And in Europe, for example, Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, has actually instituted negative loans, negative rates, where the government actually pays you to lend money from them. Like it's better than free money. And then he just sort of threw his hands up and resigned, because I mean, once you've turned the spigot on all the way, there's no way and it's not working. I mean, you have to admit that. I think this is actually just today that he resigned.
And as a minor addendum, effectively throughout a large portion of the crisis in the United States, that was effectively happening in the US as well, both in the terms of deficit spending as well as uh, lending from the central bank. Like you had the real interest rate on short term US Treasury securities being lower than the rate of inflation, which meant effectively people were so bereft of investment opportunities that they were willing to lose money to purchase these securities.
And the problem with all of these measures, and the problem we're seeing right now, is that they're not changing the base of the system. They're not improving profitability. And so if you were to look at the economy like a line of economic growth without these unprofitable businesses, like if you were to subtract every systematically unprofitable business, and look at the growth of the economy over time, you would probably see a very steep negative curve since 2008, from 2008 to today. And as we approach uh, the bubble, the bubble bursting. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Just how many years of economic activity are going to be wiped out. Go on, Dick, or go on, MDL.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing too to think about, as far as like when people have like solutions to propose as well. Uh, we often see like a lot of like pushes for like raising the wage, which is definitely like a good thing. Like people should be paid more too. But like in terms of this like tendency of the rate of profit to fall, there is also still an issue when like we're talking about this rising mass of the organic composition of capital. It puts it in a bind too, where it's just like even then like an allocation of like to cost of production to variable capital for wages also cuts into profitability. Like it becomes a double bind for the businesses themselves, so like even that measure would proceed towards collapse. And an interesting thing about the last August jobs report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that there is like a bump in wages on like a social level, and Marx alludes to this a bit in that tendency, the rate of profit to fall chapter, and even in one of the sections in the simple reproduction chapter of Capital Volume 2, there is a mention of wage rises themselves being harbingers of crisis.
Yeah, and that seems to be almost inevitable. Like you look at that very same BLS report, the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate in the United States is 3.5%, the lowest it has ever been at peacetime. So when you have effectively all labor being uh, already effectively employed, and basically the only people who are unemployed are the systematically unemployable and people who are temporarily in between jobs, you're going to create friction in how businesses are operating.
And one interesting thing about this increase in wage leading to collapse of the capitalist system is that there was sort of a Nick Land. We talk probably too much about Nick Land, but there was a Nick Landian school of sort of accelerationists. And with regards to accelerationism, I'd just like to say there is that, like, in a sense, supporting labor activism, supporting, unions and supporting higher wages and that kind of stuff. That is, in a very real sense, a form of accelerationism in the sense that it accelerates the tendency of capitalism to self-destruct and builds uh, stronger networks for surviving that inevitable collapse. So I think it's a much more legitimate form of even if you tend towards accelerationism, supporting supporting more standard left wing organizing is probably a much more legitimate way of carrying that out.
Yeah, I would
Plus,
agree
it's like
wholeheartedly.
agreed as well, because it's like I think also a thing when it gets lost in some accelerationism theory is this distancing from acceleration as really discussed in Marx, and like how that fits into capital as well. It kind of gets very muddled into, like, land is very much too overemphasized.
Yeah. So that's sort of all reaching ahead. All of these issues with profitability are all very much reaching ahead right now. Um, it's hard to keep on top of like the stuff that's developing right now. Um, Retailers are going out of business. WeWork is collapsing. More and more people are defaulting on auto loans. More shale plays, which are areas where people frack for shale oil, have closed than ever before. There's a lot of things cooking off right now, and that's just in the United States. It'd be interesting if we had like an image of the full world, like to see what was going on in China or India or Indonesia. But I think, as I understand it, large portions of the world are already in depression or recession. The manufacturing sector is in recession in the United States.
It's effectively all being held up by debt.
Hmm.
And there is a whole lot of absolute glut of capital that is looking for profitable investment opportunities. And we see that most clearly in these unicorns, that as they're called in the tech industry, these modern companies like Uber, WeWork, Lyft, Airbnb, MoviePass, these essentially capital destroying mechanisms where investors have funneled billions of dollars over the past 5 years into these schemes to find new avenues for profitability. Netflix, for example, is another, not traditionally included in this, but is definitely sort of like the point man of this to come. And Gil had something to say about Netflix.
Yeah, like Netflix basically built its business model on the promise that it would be able to monopolize as how people consume television and film. But so, like, for years, you had people sinking tens of billions of dollars into for the promise that eventually they'd get that big jackpot later on. How, however, the thing is that Netflix basically built its economy on rentiership. And once the IP holding companies woke up to this and realized that they don't necessarily need this middleman, they started cutting it out, and the bottom of the company is falling out, and they're in this death spiral of trying to borrow more debt to finance more shows in the hopes that some of them will be a big enough hit to recoup their expenses, even when times were good, they were never able to turn a profit.
And this isn't just a problem for like a sort of it's very easy to blame this on like the gig economy's particular business model and its particular way of doing business. But this is also something that we see in what we would think of as like very, very traditional businesses. Like, for example, Tesla. It has a profile of a very uh, typical industrial business. You know, they make cars, they make spaceships, they make some other technical stuff. They have a lot of R&D. They have some facilities. It's a very traditionally a very orthodox, very safe bet, and they're never making any money, despite growing very rapidly, despite making very good sales, especially for a car company of their size and their market. Like, this is a problem that's endemic to almost every industry and almost every company.
Even SpaceX, which is part of the business in Musk's portfolio that is doing most well and is mostly, almost entirely operating through contracts secured from the U.S. federal government and other governments, is still not doing that well. So large amounts of capital are being sunk into these uh, large industrial and gig economy projects without anything to see for it yet. Go ahead, MDL.
Yeah, so it's like I think like along with what Gil was talking about with the rentiership of Netflix and everything is like how much economic models along with the debt ones have also shifted onto like renter models for things. And like to think about that with like how it works for landlording and housing, you have like someone buys a property with a mortgage and like pays back on interest to that, entirely drawing from that like upon like wages from your tenantry. And there's just no like value production in that process and like how these companies or other things would be making money. It's just like purely extractive and also propped up by like these fictitious like debt forms of capital.
And it cannot be emphasized enough that these rentier forms of capital do not create value, they merely transfer it from one party to another.
Yeah, it's like perfect recipe for like any sort of real crisis. Like we're theorizing on the horizon right now and trying to understand is that like if the economy is just glutted with these forms of like renter like models, realization of like values in other places are going to be near impossible, as well as like with more people put out of work and like the growing mass of a surplus population proletariat. uh, like you like if there is a crash in a sort of like housing sector, you'll potentially see like rents.
Oh, you cut out there.
Oh, sorry about that. Like if there's like a crash in a sort of like housing sector, uh, you will see like rents so much like decline, absolutely, but they are going to raise relatively to like the wages that people will be deprived from. And like so expect to see in your like bourgeois press plenty of articles about like rents are down, but why are people still having trouble affording housing?
These are so simple things, but they just honestly cannot grasp it.
Well, they're not paid to grasp it.
It's true. It is difficult to get a man to understand something. His salary depends upon him not understanding.
Yeah. And I mean, that's sort of the trick behind all mainstream economics at this point. I know MDL did a whole thing on how the inversion of the yield curve was directly related to the creation of a crisis, and it's not like not to insult your very great work, but it's not like, as I understand it, you didn't do a huge amount of like research, and it wasn't like a year-long project to figure out the relationship between these two things. It was a fairly elegant matter of piecing things together. Do you want to, if you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and just also say too, like there are some good discussions on that thread that are helping sort of like piece together more of that. Because like I definitely like admit to not understanding the full extent of that issue, though I think there has to be something with like this. It's kind of like a slowdown in like times of like people locking up their capitals into debt securities between treasury bills and treasury bonds. So like more people end up uh, pushing like buying into these long-term treasury bonds that have like maturity rates of 10 years, and because they glut the economy with those buys, it effectively raises the yields of these short-term ones because they're like less in demand. And I guess like how these markets work in that dynamic, how the bourgeois economist understands it, like you provide like that high yield incentive to try to attract people there, but it's this sort of like inversion of that relationship and what ends up having a higher yield. And I was bringing in turnover time there too because of like what that says about like how long capital is locked up in this form, debt security. The benefit of the treasury bonds being that this is still like a marketable uh, form, like it's a marketable bond. They can still like purchase and trade and sell it, but their capital can be like locked up within that. And it makes sense that you would see large sectors of your like financial investment bourgeoisie doing this in mass when they're expecting periods of like volatility, like in crisis. Go ahead, Ailita.
Yeah, and the thing about the turning of capital over into these primarily state instruments, but also some of the more private bond securities, is that things like U.S. Treasury bonds, being backed by the full faith of the United States government, are pretty rock solid in the case of a crisis. Unless you have something really, really bad going on politically in the United States, these instruments are AAA rated. They effectively
They're
are
the
treated by
yardstick.
they're treated by the market as this will pay out in all circumstances short of the physical destruction of the United States.
Oh god.
That's why investors panicked from the temporary downgrading of the U.S. Treasury bond market from AAA to AA.
And I think it was a fair downgrade.
Yeah, there was to anyone who was too young to remember, there was a threat of a sovereign debt crisis multiple times during the Obama years, where the inability of the US federal government to come to an agreement about continued deficit spending called into question the ability of the United States federal government to make its obligations towards its bondholders.
So what we can deduce from that, what we can deduce from that lowering of the bond grade is that it is the physical destruction in the United States is getting closer at hand.
Oh, oh God, we're screwed.
Well,
Wait, don't we
Now,
want this?
It
now,
was a temporary downgrading.
although
now, not like saying the Obama years is now making me feel like like I was contemporaneous with the dinosaurs.
yeah, it was the boomer era. If you can remember Barack Obama, you're a boomer.
Insofar as Humor is a state of mind. I very much agree.
So,
Go ahead, Bong.
so I have written down some a list of uh, the bubbles that I see in the economy. I'm gonna list I think the two that I think are the most relevant, and we can go around the table and you guys can list the bubbles that you guys think are relevant. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Does everyone have like an idea? Does everyone have
Yeah,
some thoughts
I've
on
got
that?
a couple, definitely.
Yeah, I've got mine, my personal bugbear.
I definitely have some thoughts on these right now. It'll come up as these topics do.
So real quick. So I think that the things that are gonna uh, bust as a result of this recession are gonna be shale oil and fracking and the automobile industry.
Those are two very interdependent things. So yeah,
You think
if
it's
one
not fair?
bus, well, I mean, if one bus, you definitely would feel that the other is going to follow right after it.
Yeah, I think that increases their likelihood that that's going to be a focal point of the coming crisis.
Yep. So I agree. Yeah, those are definitely good points to pick on. I think uh, leading off with them because oil and particularly here in the United States, the automobile is such a part of the American way of life that
The awful way of life.
too true.
Yeah, and like you don't get this from the media depicting America, but we've already passed peak car.
Living in
Absolutely.
Atlanta, I know that for sure.
Absolutely. I've been seeing actually. So there's some very good. The people cities are starting to like ban cars in the center. I know my city, which is like NIMBY Town, USA, like the most NIMBY thing you could possibly imagine. 80% of people want to put in a new streetcar. I think there are winds of change, and I think they're just going to be driven very much faster uh, by by the recession, by the problems with people are going to have getting access to vehicles, getting access to auto loans.
Yeah, American consumers are standing at the precipice, wondering if they want to jump in the pool, and they're about to be pushed.
The other thing that I think is very interesting is that these are going to be sectors that are going to have real difficulty recouping their losses. Uh, for example, oil is competing really strongly with electric vehicles, with electric power generation, and with like more renewable resources. And when oil loses like a bit of the market, that bit of the market is lost. Uh, and if, for example, if a city puts in a new bus system as a response to spate of auto loan. Uh, the city puts in a new bus system as a response to a spate of auto loans uh, being or automobiles being repossessed so that people can get to work. You know, I think people are going to keep using public transportation because people do use public transportation. Um,
Yeah, and it's mentioning oil. Like, it's kind of interesting that we have another theatrical Dune movie coming out soon because the Dune novel is very heavily interwoven with this sort of Romana clef for hydraulic despotism vis-a-vis oil. That oil was this central commodity that made every other part of the world economy turn. And in some ways, it was almost as prescient as a novel as its main character was when it came out. When we saw 10 years after its first publication, the OPEC cartel throttling the world economy with their embargo. But now that people don't even really realize that oil is not the spice anymore, the world economy may in fact keep going without oil.
and that's I think we're sort of they're disentangling themselves. But it's going to be it's a slow process, but it's going to get a lot more violent if oil starts getting hit. For example, the issue in the United States is fracking. So fracking is keeping the U.S. oil industry alive because it's the promise of eternal cheap oil. The problem is that it's not cheap. Over the past 10 years, they've been mining they've mined out basically all the easy oil all the easy fracking sites. They're called plays, but now they haven't made any money off of that, and they're going to be going into the hard ones. And this is just when the big oil producers, Chevron and ExxonMobil, decided to jump into the fray. And like ExxonMobil starts investing hugely into fracking, and it loses 20% of its profitability just like in an instant. And I have a fascinating collection. I have a set of 2 ExxonMobil documents. One is from 2011 where they talk about like introducing fracking, and it's a very like rock solid type of argumentation. They point out the problems with it. They point out the opportunities, and they say it's very important to remember that this is not really it may appear revolutionary, but this is actually very uh, well-known technology. This is very stable. We know what we're doing with this. We're using off-the-shelf components, and we're just doing it in a new way that we think can have returns. And if you look at, there's another one from February of this year, 2019, where they're announcing that they're going to use ExxonMobil to increase Permian profitability with a digital partnership with Microsoft. And they say they're going to use AI and cloud computing to improve the profitability of their Permian Basin projects by hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's a very vague statement that hangs a lot on Microsoft making a lot of money. And it's very interesting to see like the 180 from sort of a professional expert company doing something new, but doing it with a sort of like certainty into something that like is very obviously flailing. And to lead into like conventional oil producers like Aramco is filing for an initial public offering. They're trying to get more capital. And I mean, they wouldn't be doing that. They wouldn't be changing their business model if their business model was working.
Yeah, Aramco is a state-owned oil producer.
It
has to be.
It's a oil producer owned state, but
Okay, Gilded, you had something to say about other big oil producers.
Yeah, like if you don't believe that the oil industry is in trouble, you really should look at like the the stereotypical oil producing giants like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. All of these countries are scrambling to try and diversify their economies away from fossil fuels. And in the countries where this effort is less successful, like in Russia and Venezuela, you're seeing serious economic stagnation. Like like obviously we can dismiss the people who go like, oh, it's because Venezuela's too leftist out of hand. But like Russia, the Russian economy for the longest time has been propped up by 2 things: raw material export, of which oil is their big one, and the arms export. And people make a lot of crow about how these sanctions slowed the Russian economy, but the Russian economy started to really creak to a halt as oil profitability began to decline. And crisis in Russia seems to be increasing as there's no sign of any end to the loss of oil profits.
I have a document from BNP Paribas, the bank here, that talks about what oil's break-even point needs to be in order to be competitive. And they argue that the break-even point for oil to be competitive with renewables needs to be in the 10 to 20 dollars per barrel range, which, by the way, it's in the $50 per barrel range. And if we look at there's a chart, figure 12 of break-even points for oil. There's very, very little, like less than 1% of oil production is profitable in that range.
So yeah, and when I read this paper, It was just published actually in August, so this is like hot off the presses. It kind of pulled together a whole bunch of things that I had known intuitively for a long time, but didn't put together into a big whole. And that is how deeply inefficient all of our oil economy based energy sources are. Like, and you look at the comparison, just the amount of thermodynamic efficiency of gasoline engines, which are on the order of like 20%. All right, well, I guess we're going to cut this part because I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, just that the paper is called Wells, Wires, and Wheels, Eroki, EROCI, and the Tough Road Ahead for Oil from BNP Asset Management. We're hopefully going to have a link to that PDF in the video description on YouTube. And I'm not sure if you can do that on SoundCloud, but if not, you can like Google it or just reach out to us on Twitter.
Yep. Yeah. So the fundamental part of this paper is the EROCI, energy return on capital invested. Basically, is the entire commodity relationship of that product summed up. It was like how much money has to go in order to get usable energy out of that product, and it has gotten surprisingly high for oil and other fossil fuels. We used to think of this as literally just digging money out of the ground, but it is not anymore. And it kind of relates to what has been tried to be debunked for many years, the Hubbard's peak or peak oil, is that any sort of natural resource, when you have the exploitation of it, you're going to go after the low hanging fruit first. The ones that can be recovered most easily and most cheaply are going to be recovered first. And as technology develops, as capital invests more, you go towards larger but potentially less recoverable deposits until you reach a certain point where the trend lines converge and your maximum production has been reached because it takes more and more money in order to get any money out of it. And so, right now, we're talking about the past year, an average of $60 a barrel or more for oil, and most of that energy from it gets effectively wasted. Uh, Basically, it comes down to the renewables that oil has to compete against have so much higher thermodynamic efficiency than a gasoline car. So even with the same level of capital investment, you get more energy out of wind and solar than you do out of uh, oil. And they brought up some really interesting figures in it, which I'm going to summarize right now. So, if you took the capital investment for new renewable energy projects from the year 2018 and put it all into just purchasing oil at average market rates, you'd get 2.824 petawatt hours of energy in oil. But the problem is that crude oil itself is useless. It has to be refined into usable products. So, taking that much energy in raw crude oil and then turning it into gasoline gets you 1.497 petawatts. So that's 1,497 terawatt hours of energy, which, that is almost a reduction by half. But then when you turn that into usable work from your gasoline powered car, you get 270 terawatt hours of usable energy because gasoline is a very inefficient energy source when you're using it in an internal combustion engine, particularly one the size of a car engine. And the same amount of energy, if you invested it into renewable energy at those rates, you would get over almost 10 times as much usable energy. Actually, wait, the actual relationship is closer to 6. Sorry, quick mental math. So you're looking at oil has to be trending at $10 to $20 a barrel in order to compete with new projects that are investing in renewable energy. If it's more than that, then these renewable projects will fundamentally outcompete in the long term with oil. Go ahead, Bong.
And to just visualize this, when you're the relationship for an electrical vehicle versus the relationship for a petrol vehicle. No, trains are probably a lot better than electric cars, so we'll shelve that discussion very slightly. But you literally you have a solar panel and you plug it into the grid, and that the electricity is created by the photovoltaic cells, goes into the car battery. Whereas with for example, oil, you have to invest a ton of capital into pulling out of the ground, which we've already invested that capital in the solar panel, so that equalizes out. But then you have to take it out of the ground, refine it, uh, drive it to a distribution center, distribute it into a gas station, and then you have to actually drive your car to the gas station to get more gas. So there's so much gas is just lost in the process of bringing it to market that you can see just really viscerally, I think, the difference in competitiveness. And I think this is going to be the story if so. The problem oil is facing right now. By the way, these are all current figures. These aren't talking about like in 10 years or 5 years. But the problem that oil is facing right now is very simply that it's no longer profitable to produce oil in the Permian Basin. And the implication of that is that fracking and tar sands are going to see huge amounts of capital flight once this bubble bursts, which means that the opportunities for expanding production that a lot of oil companies have staked their futures on are simply no longer going to exist in 2 years. They're going to have to look into, if they want to continue to expand their much reduced store of oil, they're going to have to invest in extremely capital intensive forms of oil extraction, like deep water drilling, which is some of the most expensive stuff that's already being closed down because it's unprofitable. You had something to say, Gilded?
Yeah, like you can basically gauge how profitable something is by how much lobbying is put into ensuring its continuation. And if you actually look at the figures, like the oil industry's grip on Western politics has been decaying for quite a while. Like for but like back in the Bush years, if you so much as suggested global warming was real, you'd have like dozens of groups jumping down your throat. But now, oil industry funded climate change denials are increasingly being pushed into a very sort of fringe position. Like it's mostly the calling card of boomer of Facebook boomers these days, and instead you're seeing like this new money clique of green capitalists who want to slide in and suck up their space and oxygen within the economy as the oil tycoons start to die out like the dinosaurs they're harvesting.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like I think that's a really interesting thing too, because like as we're seeing this like explosion in like political interest and action related to it, like the sort of like Green New Deal momentum, Extinction Rebellion, the Greta Thunberg stuff. It's like this is all like very much backed by a like large section of this like of the bourgeoisie that is like part of this like new green venture like crowd.
And it's worth noting that unlike these other unprofitable sectors of the economy that we've been discussing so far, uh, uh, green capitalism has a much more favorable organic composition of capital, um, because they simply rely on producing so much new infrastructure and so many new materials and machinery that there's a lot of room in that sort of initial production of machinery, production of specialized parts, production of new technologies, where you have a significant proportion of your money is actually going towards labor and skilled labor. And so this is forming a sort of a insurgent dynamic section of the economy. It's not currently strong enough to help buoy the economy, But I think that these green companies could become a focal point of economic activity in the coming years, and definitely a cause célèbre for progressive politics. See, it does work when you support green things, and obviously we're not sad that oil is going. You know what I mean? Like, we're talking about the success of these capitalist groups kind of ruefully, because it does suck to have capitalists come in and steal the whole show. But I don't know if we're sad that the economy is going to become a little more sustainable.
Yeah. Green capital is sliding into our DMs right now, but at this point, it's oil money has been such the degenerate part of American politics for so long. It's like the old Churchill quote about Stalin and Hitler, that if Hitler were to invade hell, he would give a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And I sort of have that feeling towards the oil industry right now. And effectively, oil is primed for, if not a crash out, then certainly a long, slow decline.
Well,
Because there is a huge amount of infrastructure that is sunk in oil that effectively has nowhere to go. And everyone who's tied to that infrastructure is going to feel the pinch of energy prices, while the economy has to wean itself off of it. Like, oil has been the dominant factor in energy production in the United States and globally for the better part of a century. And so this won't be an overnight transition. It could be a very rapid crash out without a potential solution, or it could be slowly hunting oil companies to extinction. Go ahead, MDL.
Yeah, and I think like thinking about that, like all of that together with this new like the green capitalism venture too, because like definitely like not disappointed that there's this potential for like sectors of our economy become like our energy economy to become more sustainable. But there is also the danger there too, and we're seeing this crash out, and like this section of the bourgeoisie like more poised to fill that vacuum. Like this is clearly a moment where we are very vulnerable to extending the reproduction of the capital relation in society and maintaining this. So that like that those movements are going to be need to be like watched heavily, and people kind of like caught up within them, pushed further down like their paths of radicalization, potentially being like stoked by them.
I'm thinking of that panel from Watchmen where just before Rorschach dies, spoilers by the way, he's talking to Dr. Manhattan, and he says, no, he's talking to Night Owl, and he says, I can't compromise, not on this. No compromise, not even in the face of the apocalypse. And I think we're kind of in that position where I think a lot of the left will, for very understandable reasons, compromise on this issue. I think, like, for example, DSA says they're anti-capitalist, but I mean, is the guy selling solar panels really the same kind of cap? You know what I mean? And and I do think that progressive politics there's what I mean. I think people have this idea that because sustainable solutions, because sustainable activity is not currently profitable, is not currently the mode of production, that it cannot be the mode of production within capital. And I've been looking at, for example, regenerative agriculture, which is this new, very, very cutting edge way of like incorporating crop covers and um, all kinds of really interesting stuff into farming techniques that results in more productive pastures, more productive farmland. And I think there's a tendency to see this as like, oh, so, there's an idea that like, oh, we can't do large scale industrial capitalist farming without completely degrading the soil. Well, if that's not true, and I don't think it necessarily is, then it could be very interesting to see how the left responds to this and deals with this. And I worry that a lot of the left is just going to become captured by green capitalism. You got something to say, MDL?
Yeah, and it's directly related to this too, because like I do worry about it consistently, and I think like the direction to be looking in for like what how to mitigate this is going to be like looking at like development of class organization within these movements as well too, because like while we see like plenty of energy in the DSA, like the social democratic movement at large, like we have to be looking at the class composition of those movements and like how they're forming, because like the real resistance to these things and like this capture of that energy is going to like come through like our relative like disorganization, or like the disorganization of the proletariat to effectively match that when it is happening.
Yeah.
You want to go,
To
Alita?
yeah, to sum it all up, effectively, we have to remember that we are soberly and impartially trying to talk about these trends without saying, yeah, go invest in green energy right now. As we are communists, and our line in this is and always remains the line of class struggle. So these are trends that we are observing. They are not things that we are promoting or decrying.
Yeah, and like also to mention that point, when I mentioned like DSA and like social democratic movements, I also like want to be clear too that it's just like it's really not about like whatever like organizational form or like entity is like most involved in what exactly they're doing. Like we need to be thinking like it's the in the terms of like organizing the proletariat and not the the left. Like we need to be orienting these movements very much on like the level of the class with which we are attempting to organize. So if I mention them, I'm also saying so impartially, since I perceive them right now in this moment as just vehicles.
So with that on oil and I think also cars, because it's easy to understand how higher car companies are very um, poorly profitable right now, and it's easy to see how higher gas prices could hurt their sales. Does anyone else have any other sectors of the economy? Because really, it's like a soda can. There's just bubbles everywhere. So does anyone else have a sector of the economy that they think is particularly weak?
I don't know about particularly weak, but I saw agriculture on our list, and I think that's an interesting one too, especially in terms of like climate change issues as well. Since I think it was back in May, I was seeing a map posted by the account at Build Soil. They're like part of like Ag Twitter and everything, and they were posting this map of like unplanted acres of corn at that point in the season, and in like much of your like largest corn producing state.
You're cutting out a little.
Yeah, at that time in May 2019 of your typical planting season, you had like the vast majority of these fields unplanted. So you're seeing like a very real instability in these like agricultural, and as a result, like corn futures have been shooting up.
Yeah.
Yeah, with agriculture in particular, like ag has always been in a perpetual state of crisis in the United States, and it goes back all the way to homesteading, the opening up of so much land and so many people trying to live the yeoman dream has always meant that farm prices in the US are an immense political problem that thus far has not been ever been able to be resolved. So much of US farm prices are supported by subsidies, both direct and indirect, and the largest one is becoming effectively green energy. 40% or more of the totally American crop of maize corn goes towards production of ethanol, largely for renewable energy reasons. It's become the single largest section of that crop, when traditionally most corn went as animal feed.
And so these problems are going to continue to ripple through the economy. I think I don't know what the balance books of big agribusiness looks like. I mean, it's so monopolized that either they're doing really well or they're basically complete fail sons and are in stark crisis and have been for 10 years, and I just haven't paid attention to farmers enough. Sorry, farmers.
They are complete fail sons right now. The
Yeah.
past 2 years, net farm income in the United States has been negative. People are going deeper and deeper into debt. Yeah, it is. And living in a predominantly rural state like I am, I see that effect directly every day. And on the one hand, it's the U.S. smallholder class is something of a historic aberration that's been heavily protected by the state to try to maintain this constituency. And we're looking at like there's no level of politically feasible subsidy that seems to be able to preserve this class anymore against the rising organic composition of capital. Ag is big business. The family farm, even the family farms now, are in essence corporations. And the ones that are surviving, keeping their heads above water, are the ones that adopt more mechanized practices. They till much larger amounts of land. They use much more heavy reliance on automation. And the ones who are smaller are the ones who are being squeezed out.
I think that is also something that concerns me. Like we're talking about like farm labor and other forms of labor, potentially also getting like kind of expelled in the next like phase of crisis and like recomposite or attempted recompositions or reproductions of capital. Is that like with like the migrant like border concentration camps as well? Like there's going to be a real like issue with like how that form continues to develop and what the practices within those like concentration camps like continue to be as like you increasingly see like we have this political rise of an economic nationalism responding to these crises, like the reactionary politics doubling down. Like what are those forms going to like transition to when this migrant pool is no longer like necessary?
Yeah, and that is the question that haunts me, because you already are seeing the rise of the useless eaters rhetoric among reactionaries in the United States. And that is the first step towards annihilationism. And by that, I do directly mean the parallel to the Holocaust and the physical mass murder of perceived useless eaters. And we should have no illusions about the dangerous road that this is on right now.
And I especially have a fear for it too, with like the rise of like popularity of social democratic reform, because in the sense of like prolonging this annihilationism, like just kind of kicking the can down the road, you have the potential for like a portion of the like population to be introduced positively to redistributive economics, and then you also like because it's limited by the fact that this is like a nationalist project to an extent, and like we'll be building on that scale, and the push like under like Sanders reformism such like being within like the US like national institutional political like sphere, you end up with like a real high likelihood that like further reactionaries down the road pick up on the popularity of these reforms and then like know how to play this towards like like the healthcare is not working out as well right now because it will probably be sabotaged by capitalists, like it's the migrants' fault, and that just kind of like feeds into the annihilationism.
Like when we look at the modern right, particularly the younger sections of it, we see like this shift in rhetoric from like denial of green politics to basically trying to insidiously incorporate them into their worldview as eco-fascism. Like, we're starting to see some people who unironically spout like Thanos tier takes that we need to correct overpopulation in order to meet meet the challenges of the future.
Although, like, Savriti Devi was always way, like, Turbo Thanos. She wanted, what, 10,000 humans alive? Something like that? So
yeah,
I think
there have been plenty of those cranks for a while, but it is becoming more mainstream.
I personally
mean,
think
it's so. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I personally think it's kind of unsustainable in terms of, like, as a political position, because it's funded. It's this sort of idea that population is the problem is kind of a way to excuse continued emissions. But those emissions, but I just don't see those, like, high emissions industries maintaining their control of political power over the next 10 years. And so I can't see them being, because their problem isn't being pushed out by climate rhetoric. Like, their problem has never been, tree huggers. It's pure economics, and I don't think ecofascism, like, actually will help them with their with their balance sheet.
Yeah, because the thing is, like, it's not that ecofascism itself, like, that's still fairly fringe. It's like, I think the most disturbing part is like how much you see the overpopulation rhetoric among billionaires and like liberals. And if they're not doing it with like the immediate border crisis, they're kind of displacing it to like Africa and other parts of the global south. Like Bill Gates is really into that. Like the whole Netflix, like to bring up stuff you've been mentioning, Gilded, like Netflix just put up a documentary about Bill Gates trying to save like the planet and like the ecological crisis, and he's like a big like birth control in Africa guy.
Although,
And it
go ahead, you had it.
and it just goes to just how fundamentally fucking moronic so much of the bourgeois intellectual class is about these issues. That Malthusianism never died. It always has shifted forms, but its modern rise.
One shot policy.
Yeah, with modern neo-Malthusian rhetoric being adopted even by liberals, these people have this persistent delusion that the problem is population that is causing poverty. Therefore, if you reduce the population, whether indirectly through birth control or through more direct measures, you will be able to have a larger share of things for the people who are still living. The problem is that, as we know, labor is the source of value in society. The whole production process depends upon the mass mobilization of millions of workers. If you reduce the supply of workers, you reduce the supply of total value produced by society. There's no way around it. The way ahead for capitalists who want to destroy these surplus populations of labor is their own impoverishment.
I will say that there are other reasons to support access to birth control in Africa. For a long time, like, for example, U.S. Policy towards Africa has mandated that they not support prophylactics, they not support condom use.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, this is effectively, rather than trying to view the population as a problem, we must be viewing this as a way for people to be empowered to take control of their own lives. It's not a matter of reducing or increasing populations through measure. It's the struggle for life itself and these intolerable conditions in capitalism.
Yeah, and I think like that, like the focus that the bourgeoisie places is like where it's revealing, because like even despite all of these like very positive arguments to make about like reproductive care and like birth control in these places, they're very openly coming at it from a viewpoint of population control, and they're often quite open about that. Gilded, you had a connection to make to this?
One
I mean,
thing, hold
technically,
on, before we go on, sorry to interrupt, but we are running kind of long. I don't want to give Vil too much to edit. We love you, Vil, by the way, if you see this.
Yeah, like when you look at like a lot of these billionaires, they're mostly coming from what is probably the most extreme bubble in the entire capitalist economy of tech. where you have all these companies that are just like building themselves onto a precipice that they're setting themselves to fall over in extremely dramatic fashion when finally reality ensues and the bubble breaks. Like everything from Google to Facebook is putting themselves in a very dangerous position, and they're also seem to have a much higher opinion of how much influence they can have over governments than they actually realistically would be able to exert.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that. It's like tech industry gets interwoven with every other industry, and how many times in the past few years have we seen these marketing buzzwords being adopted by numerous industries, particularly finance? Bitcoin, the blockchain, cloud computing, deep learning, all attempts to harness these technologies that most of these businessmen fundamentally do not understand as a way to get themselves out of the bind that they are in terms of profitability. That's these new measures of entrepreneurship, as the bourgeois economists call it, will be able to create new value.
So winding up, there's obviously there's a lot of bubbles to discuss. We can't really go into depth in all of them, but tech, agriculture, oil, retail, the automobile industry, housing are all, I think, very good candidates. Does anyone else have anything to add on that?
Yeah, like if we had more time, I would have. If we had more, yeah, entertainment would have been what I have brought up if we had more time.
Yeah, and all of these, everything that is downstream from these businesses is going to be affected by the bubble popping. So, in say, if the tech bubble pops, then every company that uses their services will be affected. If the auto industry collapses, then all of their supply chains are going to be uh, squeezed out. Like there's a statistic that came up very common in the '08 crash when the US auto industry was completely blown out by the shrinking of the availability of credit, where it would look like all three of the major US manufacturers were going to be bankrupt within months at this point. And while these manufacturers themselves only employed a few 100,000 people, their supply chains of everything that had been subcontracted out as part of their business model would have brought 2.5 million people into unemployment when they collapsed, which at the time was almost 2% of the US labor force.
And it's going to be like that was the knock-on effect from 2008. Like if the crisis actually starts in automobile production and automobile loans, it could be significantly worse.
And yeah, so this leads us to the value added portion of this podcast. What do you do to survive in depression conditions, which we may be facing in the near future?
Um, to be honest, none of us are quite that old. If you happen to know a very very old relative who may have lived through the depression, I don't know if anyone's. I think there's probably a few people around who were kids during the depression. Ask them. Learn to garden. If you can produce even a bit of food for yourself and for your family, or for your community, that's a huge benefit. I
Yeah.
see.
Firearm proficiency.
But really, the best way is to not close down. I mean, a lot of people are very, not socially outgoing. But I mean, in terms of depression, you have to rely on your neighbors. You have to rely on your people around you, and you have to have them be able to rely on you. And that's going to be hard because we live in a very alienated and atomized society. But if you can at all build those connections in the next few weeks, uh, by all means.
Yeah, that is fundamentally the work of the communist movement is the realization of our shared humanity as workers that is being twisted and mutilated between the gears of the capitalist system. And it will not always be legal, the kinds of self help measures that will have to be undertaken during crisis. Depending on how bad it gets, you're going to be seeing cases like in the Great Depression, where you had warehouses full of grain rotting, while you had lines of people lining up for scarce uh, bread lines and the scraps from restaurants to try to just survive the next day. And the people who helped eke out most of survival in that were people who physically often stole from storehouses of food products that were going to be destroyed. And that is, in fact, the nucleus of the Revolutionary Act, realizing that amidst all of this surplus, there is also, same time, want, and how collectively irrational it is.
And you have to remember that there isn't, just because the economy is collapsing, that doesn't mean there isn't less than there was yesterday. In fact, there's way, way more.
All these commodities that just cannot fundamentally be circulated. There's too many of them. That's the paradox of depression.
Go out, steal a TV, treat yourself.
Defy
Self-care.
the value form.
Nab that Nintendo Switch from the game store.
Yeah. It's gonna be rough. I mean, I don't know. Reach out to us on Twitter. If you have no one else, I don't know. Like, just I think a lot of it is gonna be also just psychological, just maintaining your interaction with the rest of society. And get out there.
Yeah, it's or on the level of like organizational things too. It's like find sort of like places socially where people are discussing this, and also like test out organizations that are local to you, or also like community groups that are local but not necessarily political as well, as a means of like meeting people in like structured environments in your surroundings as well too, where like these can become like focal areas where people discuss these things most immediate to their environments.
Yeah, tenant associations, community gardens, the food pantry. Volunteer work can be very rewarding in itself, and you get to meet people who might have shared values and, more importantly, a shared interest in trying to survive these coming problems.
Open a soup kitchen.
Learn to make soup.
Yeah, soup is good food.
Nice Dead Kennedys plug.
All right, yeah. Also, listen to punk.
Yeah,
I don't know if that helps.
Yep, the DIY attitude.
yeah. Learn to make bread.
Oh
And,
yeah.
like,
This is the one concession we will make to the anarcho-communist menace.
So this is the secret. This is what they really don't want you to know, is that bread is dead easy to make. It's not hard. You just need flour and water and some salt and olive oil. It's really easy. You can do it at home, and like they want you to pay $4 for pita. You can make that shit at home for less than $1. I'm dead serious.
I need to start growing my own tobacco.
And if you don't already, like, get to know your neighbors. Like, a lot of you probably have no idea who else lives on your street.
Yeah, because you move around too much trying to chase whatever job opportunities are available.
Or you live
Shifting through the educational industrial combine.
Or you get evicted too regularly by a landlord. Like, just constantly disrupting these things.
Yeah. So, in a sense, yeah, it makes it very hard to have those organic ties to people you live around. But sometimes we just have to make the effort, even if it's going to be so transient.
All right, and I think we should sort of put a plug in this now, because there's a lot to talk about. We can probably continue on some of these subjects into the next episode. But I mean, giving Bill almost an hour and a half of recording seems a little cruel. So again,
We love you,
we
Bill.
love you. We love you. You are the goddamn rock that keeps this podcast alive.
Love you, Bill.
And
All the
absolutely
things,
wonderful. Probably very attractive, a good person, pleasant to be around.
Okay,
Go
you're
get
probably laying on a little bit thick there.
Probably a
All
lot
right.
of just like raw, vital energy.
Yeah.
He possessed something of the quality of the Ubermensch.
Very lithe arms, I'm sure.
Adonis like curls. Absolutely.
muscles harder than Achilles' armor.